Good morning and good afternoon and evening for those of you who are joining us from other parts of the world. I'd like to welcome you to our PIM webinar for today. I'm Karen Brooks. I'm the director of the CGIAR research program on policies, institutions, and markets, or as we refer to it in shorthand, PIM. This is our third webinar in the 2018 series, and the topic that we're going to address today is a really interesting one: measuring food losses, a new methodology, a new approach. This is work that we have undertaken in the program, Policies, Institutions, and Markets, as part of our work on value chains and inclusion and efficiency in the value chains. So I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker today. We have with us Eduardo Nakasone, who leads our work in PIM on this subject, but we also have other colleagues who are contributing to the work as well. So Eduardo's contribution will cover not only his own work, but also that of a number of other researchers working within the program. Eduardo is an associate research fellow in the Markets, Trade, and Institutions Division of the International Food Policy Research Institute, IFPRI, and he leads this work on food loss and waste in our program. He is concurrently an assistant professor at the Department of Agricultural, Food, and Resource Economics at Michigan State University, and he's actually joining us remotely from Michigan today. We're very pleased to have him. Eduardo earned his bachelor's degree in economics from the Universidad del Pacifico in Lima, Peru, and he holds a master's and PhD in agricultural and resource economics from the University of Maryland in College Park. Now, before I hand over to Eduardo, I just want to explain how we'll handle the session today, which is the way we do it regularly. Our speaker will begin, and he'll spend about a half hour introducing us to the material, and you will see the presentation on your screens. And during the presentation, we invite you, the listeners, to send in questions via the chat and question windows that you see on the right-hand side of your screens. So I'm here with my colleague, Yevgenia Anisimova, who's our communications specialist. Yevgenia and I will collate the questions, collect them, and group them, and then we will convey them on your behalf to Eduardo during the question and answer session. And we're handling the questions this way to make good use of our time. And we're also recording the webinar, and we'll make it available on our website shortly after the live event for anyone who has expressed interest but was not able to join us today. So with that, I thank you all for joining us, and I hand over now to Eduardo to tell us about a new method for measuring food losses. Eduardo, please, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Karen. Thank you for the invitation to present this body of work that we are developing. And as you mentioned, this is joint work that we have been developing at IFPRI, but also in close collaboration with other CG centers such as SIP, ICARDA, CIMIT, and others. So, well, let's start this presentation. Thank you all for joining. So I want to give you first a quick outline of how I'm going to work. I have thought about this presentation. So first, as Karen mentioned, I'm going to talk about the development of a new methodology. So when we first started working in this area, we were looking for available studies analyzing the extent of the problem, the extent of food losses, but studies varied considerably in their measurement approaches. We're measuring different things altogether and yielded very different conclusions. And moreover, we found that there was scarce information in developing countries, and there was even less information with a diagnosis of where food losses occurred. So that's why this is the reasoning why we developed a new methodology. This methodology we designed to be applicable to a wide range of commodities and countries. I'm going to go in detail through it in a few slides. But so we developed first a methodology. Then, of course, the next logical step is to test this methodology in the field. So we applied this methodology and collected primary data to estimate food losses in 6 countries for 5 commodities with the objective of having a better understanding of the extent of the problem and then characterize the nature of food losses. Well, so now we have developed a methodology, we have collected data and analyzed it for a selected number of countries and commodities. So now what we would do with this diagnosis, so the next natural step is to test mechanisms to reduce food losses. And this is ongoing work. And I'm going to tell you some of the things that we are working on in this area. And finally, I want to tell you about where we want to expand our work in this area and explain a little bit about future activities we have in mind. So with that in mind, I'm going to start with the methodology. So when we started first reviewing what were the strategies for food loss estimation, we group the methodologies in two broad categories. One is a macro approach, which uses aggregate data. For example, I mean, a lot of this work is based on FAO food balance sheets. These are national statistics on how much food is produced, how much food is consumed, and then the difference is sort of attributed to a loss or a waste. And you know, there are huge advantages of this approach. It is cheap and straightforward because it is based on data that is available out there already. But there are some cons of it. These are aggregate data, so they are more prone to problems of measurement error. Um, and then they are not representative they don't tell us where food losses occur. I mean, it just gives you a number based on an accounting method, but this doesn't tell us where the problems are, which nodes of the particular value chains, which are the processes that are causing the food losses. Then there is a micro approach, and this micro approach is rather than using aggregate data, people collect more detailed information based on surveys, on structured interviews, or direct physical measurements in the field. And this is certainly a much more detailed approach. It gives us much more insights of where food losses are happening, but they are certainly time consuming and they are costly to implement. And also there are differences in the questionnaires and the procedures for data collection and what each study measures that makes them not necessarily comparable between themselves. So with this in mind, the intention of this slide is not to be an exhaustive um, literature review on what is out there, but we were highlighting some studies that presented evidence for more than one country or node in the value chain using the macro approach and the micro approach, and they yield very different numbers, and they are but we cannot tease out why these numbers are different. Is it because they're using different methods? Some of these have different definitions of the stages in which food losses occur. Some of them have different definitions of the units in which food losses are expressed. For example, should it be physical quantities? Should it be value? Should it be total calories that are lost, etc.? And then we also found again that there was scarce evidence for developing countries. So this is where we were standing when we started this, and then as I mentioned, we decided to go for a new methodology to measure food losses. We believe this methodology basically brings 4 improvements to what is already out there. So the first one is that we consider the agricultural process as a whole. We take pre-harvest, harvest, and post-harvest losses, stages in the agricultural production. Second, we use a value chain approach. So we have detailed questionnaires for different nodes of the value chain, for farmers, for middlemen, for processors, to try to tease out where in the value chain the losses are happening. And third, we are not only quantifying lost quantities, but we are also gauging the economic value of quality deterioration. So in developing countries, food is not is in rare occasions discarded. What happens is that it is sold in markets at reduced prices, or if it is not rendered fit for human consumption, it can also be used as animal feed. But it is not that it is discarded and thrown away. So we have to really dig into what are the think about food losses as a quality that has an important quality deterioration aspect to it. And fourth, we try to identify what are the most frequent reasons of losses. And this is important because only knowing the reasons of the losses is where we can design better policies to address the challenges that we are facing. So the first thing that I mentioned is that our approach includes losses along the production process. So if we really think about what we're trying to get at is we are trying to avoid scrapped food, food that is discarded or food that is of poor quality. And there has been a recent emphasis on post-harvest losses, but within significant variability in the definitions. And the emphasis on post-harvest losses is attractive. Previous research has focused on yields. There have been mixed experiences with that, but the idea of analyzing post-harvest losses is interesting because it tells us how to reduce losses of what has already been harvested. However, food losses do not only occur because of post-harvest processes. Food is also scraped due to, for example, management problems during pre-harvest. What we found in a lot of like our visits to developing countries is that, for example, farmers harvested beans or wheat that have field fungal infections on it, and they are rendered unusable or unconsumable because of that, or they harvest maize cobs that are affected by earworm damage, and then they cannot be used again, or that significantly affects the quality. It also happens at harvest. For example, inefficient harvesting techniques for potatoes have the potatoes split or break up during the harvesting. So, and we have also found that some of the production is even unharvested. It's left in the field because sometimes the agricultural prices are low, so farmers think that it is not worth their while to harvest what they have already in the field, leave it there, or sometimes because there are high labor costs around harvest time due to the agricultural cycle in developing countries, people harvest at the same time, and then that increases the cost of labor to harvest. So the idea here is that we want to tackle not only post-harvest losses, but more integrally factors that have food being scrapped along the entire production process. The second thing that I mentioned is that we have a value chain analysis. So in here, I wanna start with a technical distinction for people who are not familiar with the jargon in this area. In general, we consider food losses to happen before product reach consumers, and we consider food waste starting from consumer access onwards. And what the available literature tells us is that food waste is more prevalent in developed countries, and this is not covered in our work because most our work is focused on developing countries, really. So, and food losses are more important, conversely, food losses are more important in developing countries rather than developed countries. So what we cover here is a value chain approach where we are covering production, post-harvest, distribution and logistics, processing, etc., through representative samples of farmers, middlemen, and processors. Third thing that I mentioned is that we are assessing quality losses. And food with quality deterioration might not be discarded, as I mentioned, but there is an economic loss that we wanna get to. And for these, there is no clear way to measure this, but we have different alternative methods to try to capture these quality losses. So the first one is a subjective measure. This is a catch-all phrase in some questionnaires. How much of your production did you lose? And then farmers give you an estimate of that. So it's a rather general, subjective, self-reported approach. But we wanted to incorporate these quality losses more explicitly, and we asked ourselves what happens when we try to dig into these quality variables more in detail. And we have three other methods, which are called the categories, attributes, and prices. So in the categories method, the categories method is based on a visual scale methodology, and it hinges upon implicit grades in markets. So there are understandings between buyers and sellers in markets about what is considered first grade, second grade, third grade quality. The grades vary significantly by market and product, but for example, in potatoes, the important dimension is the diameter of the potato. In beans, there are some other aspects such as size, coloration, the presence of insects, etc., that render them first category, second category, or third category. And then we ask farmers to have their production categorized in these grades so that we can assess what is the quality downgrade that happens in the production process. Then there are attributes. So in attributes, we we have detailed lists of undesirable attributes in commodities. For example, in the case of beans, it's humidity, mold, broken grain, weevil perforations, premature grain. These attributes vary by crop and country, but we have worked with local agronomists to try to determine these characteristics. Now, all of these undesirable attributes, all of these damages, are attached to a price penalty in the market, so we are also able to assess through our surveys and quantify what is the economic value of this quality of quality downgrades based on the list of these attributes. And finally, we have a price method, which, the idea of the price method is that prices capture any quality downgrades in the markets. So how much lower is the actual sales price compared to the optimal? And the idea that prices capture different qualities gives us a sense of what is the extent of quality losses. So again, subjective method, categories method based on grades, attributes based on undesirable attributes or damages, and prices where we think that prices are good proxies for quality. And finally, I mentioned that what we are trying to do with this methodology is try to detect where the losses occur. Does it happen in the field? Does it happen during post-harvest processes in the farm? Does it happen during transportation? Or does it happen through processing along the value chain? So now I have laid out what is the basic idea behind our methodology. The natural step is to take this methodology and use it in the field. And here we're going to discuss applications to 5 commodities in 6 different countries. And the countries are Ecuador, Peru, Guatemala, Honduras, Ethiopia, and China. And the commodities we focus on are potatoes in Ecuador and Peru, beans and maize in Guatemala and Honduras, teff in Ethiopia, and wheat in China. So these are very distinct results there are particular results by country and commodity, but I want to give you some general takeaways of the research that we have been doing across all of these countries that are somewhat consistent in the different in the data that we have collected. So the first one is that food losses are important. Depending on the method, they range from 8 to 26%. And in here, what we have is, again, when I explain the methods, the S is the subjective method, C is the categories method, A is the attributes method, which is based on damage penalties, and P is the price method, which is the differential with respect to the ideal prices that farmers could have got in the market. But regardless of the methodology, it seems that food losses are important, and though the range varies. Second, they're much larger when we account for quality losses. So as I mentioned, the categories, attributes, and price methods are dig into the quality, disaggregate quality downgrades. And when you stress that, you find that your measurement of food losses is higher than otherwise. And that is consistent across countries that we have worked in. Third one is that most food losses happen at the farm level. When we analyze what is the share of food losses that originate at the farm level, it ranges between 56 and 86%, depending on the country. And fourth, the main problems in general that we have identified across countries, and this is a generalization, but we find that there are weather-related issues. There's lack of knowledge of available technologies, mechanization and access to infrastructure, and lack of price incentives. So that is a general overview of what we are finding in these countries. We also want to identify in which part of the production process losses occur. At least for some of our methods, we're able to tackle this. And what we find is that losses are important in post-harvest phases, but so are the losses in the pre-harvest and harvest stages. So this is also going to our argument that the importance of analyzing integrally the whole production process. So we have designed the methodology, we have applied it to different countries and commodities, and what we have done is we're trying to do a little outreach and dissemination of our findings. We have presented our work in academic conferences for exchange of ideas and feedback from other experts in this area. We have also presented these at country events to promote the use of our tool with governments, civil society, and other relevant organizations. We are also partnering with international forums such as the G20 or FAO in disseminating our findings. And as part of the, so for example, as part of the G20 agreements, IFPRI works with FAO on the technical platform for food loss and waste. And the idea of this technical platform is that we present our methodology, we present on how to implement it, and have people use that information to expand the applications of this methodology, and that it becomes more widely available, and that we have more data using consistent measurement strategies. So we did the methodology, we applied to different countries. We have these diagnoses, at least for selected countries in and selected commodities. So the next phase that is ongoing right now is we're trying to test interventions to reduce food losses. So I'm going to describe projects that I am involved in and my colleagues in other CG institutes are also working on. So we have three ongoing projects. The first one is, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this particular project because this is the one that I'm working on, is about input provision versus market-based contractual agreements. And I'm going to go explain a little bit more in a few slides. Then CIMIT is working on maize in Ethiopia and testing the effect of triple sealed hermetic storage bags. That is work led by Hugo de Groot. And SIP is working on in potatoes in Ecuador, testing the effect of handheld farmer decision tools that provide rules of thumbs of farm management techniques among potato farmers in Ecuador. So we are testing three distinct approaches in how to in potential solutions for the problem. One is market-based incentives. The other one is related to technology adoption, and the third one is related to extension and management. So I think this provides an interesting opportunity to see how all these very distinct mechanisms can help reduce food losses in developing countries. So in the case of Guatemala and Honduras, I want to talk about what we're doing and why we're doing it. So some of the reasons of the losses among bean farmers in Guatemala and Honduras a lot of them are pre-harvest reasons. And a lot of the respondents said that their crops were highly affected by pests, by diseases, by lack of rain, etc. Some other problems to a lesser extent, but problems out there are problems at harvest and finding labor and damages that happen in the harvest stage. So what we are doing here is what we are testing input provision versus market-based contractual agreements. So as I mentioned, the losses among bean farmers in Guatemala and Honduras, a lot of them are because of pest diseases and lack of rain, and just to some extent for other reasons, such as inefficient harvesting or labor constraint. So a couple of potential policies we thought of, okay, one avenue can be provide access to improved inputs, improved seeds and fertilizers that are resistant to plagues, that are tolerant to drought, and the fertilizer required to use is improved seeds. But another way of thinking about that is, incentivizing increases in quality through market-based contracts. So if we establish contracts that incentivize farmers to improve the quality of the seeds, they are receiving a premium for better quality. Is that going to incentivize the farmers to get the improved seeds, fertilizer, and adopt other measures, maybe to by themselves increase the quality of their crops? So which of these approaches work better? And we are testing this through field experiments, and we're partnering with public and private sector institutions in Guatemala and Honduras to do this. So in the case of Honduras, we are partnering with the government, interestingly. So we are working with the bean producers that we have already in the baseline, and then we're testing. Again, we're doing a field experiment with 3 experimental arms. One is the provision of inputs, in this case, improved seeds and fertilizer. We have another experimental arms where farmers receive this the option to enroll in market-based contractual agreements that are quality contingent, and then a control group. And our partners here are the Department of Agriculture and Livestock of Honduras and the Honduran Institute of Agricultural Marketing. In the case of Guatemala, we're partnering with the private sector. So I think it's interesting that in one country we're doing it with the public sector, in the other country we're doing it with the private sector, so that it can give us an idea of how different partnerships can which are the actors that can better help us reduce the extent of food losses. So in the case of Guatemala, it was not possible to randomize across the 3 groups. The private sector company that we're working with was interested in beans from a particular variety and that come from a particular seed, but we are testing the joint effect of improved seeds and fertilizers and the quality contingent price premia, and we are partnered with, as I mentioned, the private sector, Albay, which is a very large agro-industrial company in Guatemala. What we are doing right now is we are collecting data on physical measures of quality. So we're putting a lot of work in having systematic sampling of beans in storage for the farmers that have been involved in the project. We're using spears and random sampling of bags to extract representative samples of farmers' production. We test in very detail humidity, moisture content, humidity levels of the beans. We are assessing the damages in the bean samples, and we're trying to detect the particular damages. Some of the damages that we can detect with that, for example, are the presence of insects or particular crop damages, attributes that are related to the attributes that we measured in the attributes methodology that we developed. So for example, we assess whether there are weevil perforations, where there is fungus, whether there is broken grain, where there's wrinkled grain, etc. And the idea of this is that this will allow eventually to contrast the survey-based reported damages with actual physical losses, and try to give us an idea of whether they are different, what are the directions of biases. Can we do larger household surveys and that'll be okay, or do we need to really dig into physical measurements? So as I said, we're collecting our end-line household survey. We're going to be using a similar approach as baseline to measure food losses, using the subjective categories, attributes, and price methods. We're going to assess whether the interventions had any changes in food losses between treatment arms, and whether these market-based contractual agreements or the provision of inputs have any effect in reducing losses among bean farmers in Guatemala and Honduras. We're also trying to assess whether there are some welfare implications of food losses, estimate changes in income, expenditures, etc., and at least have an idea of welfare implications using partial equilibrium. And as I mentioned, again, trying to complement physical measures and compare them with household self-reported measures of food losses. So I want to wrap up with conclusions and future activities. So some of the conclusions are that we have developed this new methodology to measure food losses. We are, again, including the entire production process. We are measuring these food losses along the value chain. We are accounting for reductions in not only quantity, but also importantly quality, which is a crucial aspect according to our results. And we are identifying relevant processes where we should focus on to reduce food losses. Another conclusion is that food losses are important. They are especially important at the farm level and when accounting for quality. The conclusion is that we need to account not only for post-harvest, but also pre-harvest and harvest losses, which are important for quality, not only for yields, but that a lot of the quality downgrades, which are important to food losses, occur due to pre-harvest processes and harvest processes. So try to improve the management in these stages is also crucial to reducing food losses. we developed we with this we apply this methodology to 5 commodities in 6 countries. This is still a limited sample of commodities and countries, but the idea here is that we wanted to provide a proof of concept that this can be widely applicable, that we can get rich information and comparable estimates of food losses to better understand them. But we certainly need to expand the application of our methodology to gain better understanding of food losses. And finally, we are testing alternative interventions to reduce food losses in developing countries. Most of our interventions are currently in the field. So hopefully you will stay tuned and find the results of these research interesting. Some of the future activities that we're thinking of is, as I mentioned, we're trying to disseminate the methodology to measure food losses. We are trying to consolidate this methodology as a public good that is accessible to people to use by other research institutions or the private sector to use in their own countries. We're also, for that purpose, doing country workshops where we promote the use of this methodology. We are testing potential mechanisms to we want to test additional potential mechanisms to reduce food losses. As I mentioned, we have this spread of interventions, but there are potentially more things that we can be testing out there that can be more effective, and we want to do that in the future. And we want to. So we are currently expanding our application. I am working in a project in Ghana, where we're going to measure food losses in the value chains of yams and groundnuts in 3 northern regions. We want to incorporate studies for perishable crops. So far, we have worked a lot on staple crops. Well, I mean, the reason for that is that most of poor households and the households that we're focused on grow staple crops, but and that is a little more widely applicable. But we certainly want to gain better understanding about perishable crops and what is the extent of food losses there and how to reduce them. We're also working with the T20, which is the technical group of the G20, who have approved a technical brief to scale up the methodology, and this is future joint work with the World Bank. And yeah, well, that is mostly what I wanted to present today. So I want to thank you for being here, and I am ready to take any questions that you have.
Okay, thank you so much, Eduardo. We asked you to spend about a half hour on this, and I think you've done that exactly. So very well done, and an excellent introduction to the material. We have a lot of questions that have come in, and I want to turn to them in a minute. But I think.
Oops, sorry.
Are you still there?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
terrific. Okay. As I listened to the presentation, some of the questions are related to this, and I want to summarize a little bit and have one round of additional commentary. I think that when we within PIM embarked on this research program on food loss, it was food loss and waste, but ultimately we focused more on food loss. I think it was at a time when food prices were very high. There was a lot of concern about increased hunger on the part of poor people. And there was a sense that the food losses were so high that, and the focus was always on post-harvest loss. The idea was that post-harvest loss was so high in the range of, 40, 50, 60%. There were these fantastic numbers being presented, but they were kind of all over the place. And there was a sense that you could address the hunger issue, particularly in an environment of high prices, if those food losses could simply be recovered or avoided in the first place. We'd have that much more food. And so that's a kind of simplistic concept of food loss that I think a number of us had in mind, and we were encouraged by the external environment to have that in mind when we launched on this work. But as I listen to you, I think what you've encouraged us to do is to adjust our concept of food loss and not to focus exclusively on post-harvest loss, but rather to recognize a number of features of the whole concept of loss. And one of them is that it's quite significant. The numbers are probably not so high. The specifically post-harvest numbers that are coming out of your measurements are probably not as high as those rather fantastic numbers that were presented initially, but in the range of 8 to 26%, they're still quite significant. But perhaps more significant is the idea that the losses occur across the continuum, that a lot of them are actually on the farm level. They're pre-harvest or during harvest, not post-harvest. That when you bring quality into it, that matters probably as much as quantity, and that there's a linkage between the production and harvest losses and the post-harvest losses. So the separation, as we originally thought, doesn't really work. Now, if that's a correct interpretation of your work, I think that's really important to get out there, because I think it's a different concept than is behind a lot of the thinking of the G20, of the original establishment of the FAO technical platform to measure food loss. I think it's a new conceptual frame for thinking about the problem, and I'd like to have your reaction to that for a minute before we go into some of the more detailed questions.
Yeah, so you're right in the reading of what we're trying to get at. So as I mentioned in one of my slides, yeah, there has been considerable attention to post-harvest losses. Like, and then all these debates started because there are estimates in the popular press that say that food loss and waste amount to 1/3 of the total food production in the world, which I consider to be rather high. And then people were saying, okay, if these are the food loss and waste, it's related to, it has to be related to post-harvest losses. And as I mentioned, post-harvest losses is an interesting idea because you are making more food available with what you're already producing. And that, I think that is your reading, that is my reading. And but when you start thinking about the extent of post-harvest losses, then yeah, as you said, I mean, we're finding 8 to 26%, but that is including all nodes of production. That is including all the production process and not only post-harvest, and that is including quality, the quality aspects of it. When we disentangle, and what we find is that losses occur at the farm level. That's where we have to focus our attention. But at the farmer level, when we separate pre-harvest and post-harvest losses, we find that post-harvest losses are not as large as what people are finding. And this is not only our work at PIM finding that. There is literature out there pointing out at the same direction. So for example, Kaminsky and Christensen have a paper analyzing farmer losses in Malawi, Tanzania and Uganda, I think, and then they find that the extent of post-harvest losses is between 1.5 and 6%. Bart Minton and Tom Riordan have another paper on potato losses, post-harvest losses in potatoes in Bangladesh, India, and China, and they find that it's between 3 and 6%. Bart Minton also has another paper for teff in Ethiopia that finds that post-harvest losses for teff are between 2 and 3%. So our numbers are consistent with previous findings that post-harvest losses are important, but are not as large as was originally thought. But we want to bring attention to other potential ways of reducing food losses that you mentioned. One is the quality aspect of food losses that has not been that much addressed in the literature. And second is that food losses are not only related to post-harvest management, but also to pre-harvest and harvest stages that are crucial, or even more important than post-harvest handling.
Okay, and I think that's very helpful, because I think that one interpretation of the consistent findings that post-harvest losses, as measured rather rigorously, are lower than the big numbers that were thought initially. I mean, one could just say, okay, let's walk away from this problem. It's not really worth a whole lot of attention. But I think your approach by bringing in the quality and the linkage between pre-harvest management and post-harvest outcomes is a way of saying it's still a really important issue and we shouldn't walk away from it. It affects large amounts of both income and food available for very poor people. So I do think that that's a new kind of interpretation of the concept, but it brings up a question which came in from one of our listeners. It said, okay, you have a new methodology, you have some new findings. Now, how does that compare to the Food Loss and Waste Standard Protocol, which is proposed and developed by the World Resources Institute, WRI? WRI has been a leader in a lot of the work on um, food loss and waste and has been championing much of the work under SDG 12.3. So could you tell us a little, that's the SDG that addresses food loss and waste. Could you tell us a bit about how you see your work in conjunction or in, complementary, or perhaps giving us different insights than the work of WRI?
Well, the WRI has been working on collecting how people have been measuring food losses. I think because, as you mentioned, we are in this work, we're trying to challenge this notion of how do people think about food losses? How do people think about post-harvest losses? How to bring quality into this equation and the importance of bringing quality. So I think this is an input in terms of how we think and conceptualize food losses, and it's bringing new elements to it. Yeah, for sure.
Okay, great. Now, we've had a couple of questions that relate specifically to the methodology. It
Hmm.
sounds like what you're doing is very rigorous. It's very informative. It also sounds a little bit complicated. It sounds kind of costly. And a specific question that came in was, how complicated is it? How costly is it? How do you deal with issues of representativeness and perhaps the external validity of what you're finding? Because you have to do very detailed work in very specific environments. So let's start with that, and then I'll come back with another question related to, is this complicated or not?
Okay, so it is. I think that if we want to get a good approximation of what are food losses, we have to go through the painful process of doing complicated stuff that might be costly to better understand the information that is out there and what is the real extent of the problem. Now, having said that, one of the complications in the approach that we are using so far is that there is no validation of an appropriate method of how to measure food losses, especially taking into consideration these quality aspects to it. And this is something that we are trying to learn, right? And this is part of the research that we are putting out there. There are different ways of measuring food losses and bring in the quality aspect to it. There is no consensus on how to measure it. We know little about it. Let's try to see which are approaches that that are suitable. Like, are these all these? What we find is that at least at the farmer level, the measures of our categories method or attributes method or the price method yield numbers that are in the same ballpark, that are quite similar. We are trying to say, okay, if we incorporate physical measures and compare them to the self-assessment methods using this methodology that we have developed, which one is closer, which one is further away. So this is a process that, there is no one can tell you at this point, okay, this is what you should do to measure food losses. This is what you should do to, especially with our concerns that these are the way to measure food losses, bringing in pre-harvest, harvest, and post-harvest aspects to it, bringing quality aspects to it. So yes, it the research is complicated because we have to try different things in the field, but eventually the objective is to streamline this process and come up with more robust evidence from different countries and commodities and say, okay, we have tested it this time and again, and maybe you can drop these two methods. Maybe this is the one that is closer to physical measurements. You can do only you can do survey-based data collection and it will be fine, or you do need to do more scientific testing and physical measurements on the field. That's something that we're trying to better understand.
Okay.
So in the short answer to that is the testing of these alternative possibilities on how to measure food losses is, yes, indeed complicated, but hopefully we will this body of work will inform us on how to do it in a cheaper and more streamlined way soon.
Okay.
Okay.
It reminds me a little bit of the early experience with the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index. That was, again, a new method for measuring something that was considered to be important for the development process and for interventions to facilitate development in rural areas and agriculture. And so a new method was developed, the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index. It was tested and applied and met with quite a bit of enthusiasm initially, but the feedback from the operational side was this is too complicated for us to do on a daily basis. We need a simplified, sort of more operational version to work with. And so right now, the team sort of, I would guess maybe 8 years, 6 years into the process, is developing and testing that simpler operational version of the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index. Do you think that we will get to a stage where we have a simpler operational version of a food loss measurement index, or whatever you might call it, and some way that this very useful approach could be taken on board and applied by our very operational colleagues? And how do you
Yes, I
plan to
mean,
get there? How do you plan to get there, Eduardo?
that is the general idea, right? And part of these part of these process, for example, some of the highlights that we're finding again is that if you want to tackle food losses in developing countries, the important part is that you focus on the farm level. And across the value chain, we see that these are the stages where the bulk of the problem is happening. So, well, I mean, if you want to streamline the process, it might be the case that if we what we have found so far in these 5 commodities and 6 countries is that the farmers are the most important stage to tackle. Now, when we get a little bit more data with more countries and more commodities, will that still be the case? If it is, then that informs you on where data collection should happen. Also, as I was telling, we test alternative methods because there is no method out there that has been validated. That's what we are trying to do. So maybe do it at the farmer level and do it with one of the measures. So those are avenues that we are considering, but we are still at an early stage where we need to get a little bit more data and have more experiences in a variety of situations and specific regional aspects and commodities to sort of come up with a serious answer saying, okay, this is the way to go. But we will try to get there for sure.
Thanks, Eduardo. We have some contrary evidence coming in from a listener from Rwanda. She's saying that we're measuring post-harvest losses. We're finding about 60% in the post-harvest phase, not in the pre-harvest. And I'm trying to see what commodity they're working
Yeah.
with. And she's arguing that it's 60% damage to perishables during the post-harvest period. The food was not lost, but it was badly damaged and it could not be stored, and the offered prices were very low. I guess since we don't know what that is, and we also had another question, would your methodology be appropriate for fruits and vegetables, highly perishable things, or how might you, change your methodology? But I guess the feedback from Rwanda saying there is actually a significant, we're measuring a significant problem at the post-harvest level. So maybe it's a little bit premature to say we should zero in on the pre-harvest and the production level without focusing on the post-harvest. How would you react to that?
So, okay, first of all, if I understood the question correctly, the listener from Rwanda is working on perishable crops. Well, at least that's what I think. And well, one of the points that I was mentioning in the slide is that we need to expand this methodology to perishable crops. This methodology is applicable to vegetables and fruits. So far, we haven't tested it, but we are looking forward to the opportunity to doing that. Now, the general understanding is that food losses are higher among perishable crops than staple crops. That is true. I cannot give you a number of how much food losses are in perishable crops without having undertaken such study. It might be the case that the listener in Rwanda is working with a more perishable crop that is subject to more damage. It's also hard to say without knowing the methodological design and how was the question measured. So I mean, it would be interesting if this listener can send me the study to take a look at it. I think it would be interesting. Now, I mean, I agree with you. It might be still a little premature to say, okay, this is very small, but our research is consistent with a growing literature that is pointing out, and I was mentioning studies a little while ago that are also analyzing staple crops in developing countries, such as Kaminsky and Christensen, Minton and Riordan, Minton, Afonion has another analysis based on meta-analysis. There is another paper out there using PICS data that also finds that post-harvest losses are not as high for grains, which are not perishable crops but grains. But in terms of staple crops, our evidence is consistent with this growing literature. Now, one of the reasons why we still think about it and is that there isn't necessarily a consensus, but yeah, we are trying to get there and contribute to a better understanding of this, right?
Okay. An interesting observation. One of the listeners has noted and must have studied your slides in great detail, but he observes that the subjective and the improved methods from your graphs,
Uh-huh.
For the middlemen and the processors, they seem to give roughly comparable findings about losses and quality, but that at the farm level, the subjective measure provides a much more sort of optimistic view of both the quality and the quantity of the product than the improved methods reveal. So it seems that farmers have a subjective view of their product, which is kind of more better than the evidence once you dig into it confirms. How would do you agree with that interpretation, and how would you explain that?
I mean, the subjective measure is consistently lower than the three improved measures that we are presenting. That is right, and that is one of the observations of this research, is saying, okay, farmers, when you ask farmers, because I mean, there is a lot of measurement out there based on household surveys where you would directly ask farmers, how much did you lose? When farmers are thinking about losses, they might not be incorporating all the quality aspects of food losses in their mind. So yes, the three improved measures are larger in terms of both quantity and quality, because when you highlight these quality measures, and this is one of the points of the paper, is when you get higher losses. I don't know if that answers the question.
Okay, so it's really an issue of perception of quality.
It is an issue of of quality not being adequately captured by a catch-all question to the farmer. When you bring attention to it, then you realize that they are much larger than this perception. Yes.
Okay. Now, another listener said, okay, in the developing world, you're focusing on loss, basically from the production up to and through the distribution, but not really at the retail. You're not going into the waste category. which is so high in middle income and developed countries. But in fact, as the markets are evolving in developing countries, as they go from even low to middle income and with urbanization, you're getting enough changes in the food systems that maybe we should be looking at waste even in low and middle income countries and not having this sort of artificial separation where we say we care about loss in low income countries and we care about waste in high income countries.
Sure, that is an avenue, especially in middle income countries. It would be interesting to see what is the extent of food waste. That is something that we can look at the future. In the future, I think it would be extremely interesting, but all in all, there had to be a starting point. So the scope of what we can measure is limited, especially in these initial phases. And we strategically decided to focus in this. It might be a somewhat artificial division between food loss and food waste, but there is a point where you have to start. Hopefully, we will be able to expand this into food waste measurement in at least middle income countries, for sure.
Okay. Now, let me ask you, I guess we're getting to the end, but I do want to put out a tough question at the end. I mean, we've talked about the different approaches, the macro approach, the micro approach. We've talked about the complications and the challenges of using the micro approach, even though it gives better estimates. But if we look at the SDG 12.3, which addresses food loss and waste, it has a specific target for the high-income countries, 50% reduction in waste. It doesn't have a specific target for the low-income countries. It says reduce food loss. But nonetheless, if it's to have meaning, it has to be measurable. And so it would have to be measurable on a fairly a recurrent periodicity in order to understand whether it's going up, down, or staying the same over time. So based on what you have found, Eduardo, what advice would you give to the champions who are going to be behind this SDG, specifically with regard to food loss? If we're not to use the rather simplistic food balance sheet assessments of food loss, if we want something a bit more informative, what should we do in the interim to have a better understanding of the magnitude of losses and how they're changing over time?
So it is, trying to get an indicator of food losses that you can track over time, it is a complicated issue. I have been involved in the FAO meetings because as custodians of the SDG 12.3, they are the ones who have to come up with an indicator that you can track over time. And it is certainly rather complicated. Now, I think there are interesting approaches out there that that can be useful. For example, there are the AGRIs, the agricultural integrated surveys that are being measured in developing countries, where the conversation has been to include a rotating module that might include, for example, household data on food losses. I think that is an interesting avenue to expand. So I think we have to get a little bit more creative in terms of how we approach this problem, and there is unfortunately no simple answer to the problem.
Okay, well, I told you, Eduardo, that I was going to give you the hard question at the end, and that there it is. And I agree that it's an important question, but a difficult one that we don't really know the answer to yet. But
So I mean, even if the FAO is trying to come up with a measure, but there is not even a lot of macro available data. Actually, they are using there's a process where they're trying to proxy that through other variables, and that speaks also not only. I mean, when I say that there is more data available in the macro approach, I'm not saying that all data is available in the macro approach, which makes it even more complicated.
right, but I think that we accept difficult challenges and difficult questions, and I think we recognize that this issue has a whole lot of them associated with it. So we have to close now. We had a lot of questions that came in, some of which we were able to summarize and pass on to you. Others may still be out there. So I would encourage people who are not satisfied with the way we conveyed your questions to, go to the website, look again at the recording of the webinar, and then feel free to approach Eduardo with follow-up as needed. And we'd be happy to keep the conversation going. But I want to thank you, Eduardo. I think that it's been a very good introduction to a tough topic, one that I think we've learned quite a bit about in the approximately 5 years, I think, that we've been investing in this. It's one that we'll continue to have to learn more about, but I think you've given us some conceptual insights that we certainly didn't have 5 years ago. You and your colleagues, I think, are doing this, and we really appreciate that, and we'll look forward to learning more as you take this forward in the coming few years. So thank you very much, Eduardo. Thank you to all the listeners who joined us, and please do check the recording and come back for future webinars.
All right, great. Thank you, everyone.